Welcome back. So we're on to episode 6, and today we are going to be learning how to make this, which I think is our first sort of photorealistic object, and it's very, very simple. And we're doing this so that we can learn about texture mapping and image textures. And this is actually a real object. I have it here. It's sitting on my desk, and what it is essentially just an elongated cube or rectangular prism here. It's only got 8 verts, but it is mapped to a texture which I made of this object. So to get started here, we're going to open up a new file. We have just our cube, and what I'm going to do is just GZ1 and confirm just to bring it up to the world plane, and then I'm going to go ahead and actually, with snapping turned on, which you can turn on up here, and let me turn on screencast keys. I'm going to go down to edge snapping, and I'm going to hit control period, with the object selected here, in order to drag its origin, and then GZ to drag it down and just snap it to the bottom here. And it's going to put the origin right down here at the center, so that we're scaling it down towards that spot. All right, so control period to turn that off. And now what we want to do is I want to go into this item properties here on the right. So if you hit N on your keyboard, it'll open up this item properties. And I want to change the X dimension to 0.124 meters and the Y dimension to 0.065652 meters. And the Z dimension to 0.0337 meters. And the reason is that is the real world scale of this object. So we just measured it. That's how big it is. So with that, we're going to Control A to apply scale. And now this is the scale of our object. So the modeling piece is done. We've made the object super easy. Next, what we need to do is bring in our image textures. So over here on the right hand panel, we're going to go to the material properties and give it a material. If you by default it'll have this material. If it doesn't, you can just add a new material here, and I'm gonna rename it by double clicking to Matchbox, since that's what this is. And then up here in the top, I'm gonna go and click on this shading tab. And we haven't spent much time in here yet. The shading tab we looked at just sort of very briefly when we were starting to look at materials, but what we're going to do today is we're going to start looking at how we can actually bring image samples into Blender and use them as textures applied on our objects. So I'm going to leave a link in the description to the image files. I've uploaded them to my Imager page there, so you can download them and just grab them to use for this project. And what you can do is you can do this a couple of different ways. In order to bring an image into the shader tab, and make sure that we have this correct material selected, which we've only got one material now, so that's pretty straightforward. But then as long as you have this material of interest selected, down here in this node window, you can hit Shift A, texture, image texture, and it will bring in this node here. And what this is essentially an empty slot for an image texture that you can link to an image texture on your computer. So this doesn't currently have anything in it. It is just an empty container, and let me just zoom in on this cube here. You can see if we change the color of this using the base color, that is affecting the base color of our image. What we can actually do is we can take the color output of this image texture node and plug it into the base color. And now it's going to use the image texture that is in this container as the base color for this object. And you'll notice right away that nothing happens. We don't have a color here, and that's because we haven't selected a texture yet to go inside this node. So what you can do is you can hit open and go and search for your image. Mine is just on the desktop. I believe it is this one for me. And you can see now the image texture is applied there. And if I open up that image, this is what the image looks like. If you've downloaded it from the link in the description, you will have seen it already. But this is now being applied to the surface of our object. And if we zoom in here, as long as we're in material preview mode up here in the top right, you should see that image now on this object. Now we have an issue here, which is that our image is not really correctly laid out across the surface of the object. And the reason for that is because we need to tell the object essentially how to lay this across the surface. And all right, so if you can imagine that we have our three-dimensional object. This is our this is our object here, and it is 3D. We want to take a two-dimensional surface and two-dimensional image texture and put it all over the surface of the object. And how can we do that? Because we have a 3D object but a 2D image texture. And so the way that we do that in 3D modeling is using UV unwrapping and placing seams around the object. So you could imagine if we have this object here, what we could do if this was a solid object, we could cut seams all the way around this cube in sort of the correct places, and then unwrap it so that it is completely flat. And now we've converted the surface of our 3D object into a 2D surface. So that's what UV unwrapping is essentially it's the process of taking the the three-dimensional object that you have and unwrapping its surface onto a flat 2D plane, and that 2D the 2D representation of your object surface is the UV map. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay this out using the same pattern that you would use to lay out anything that's sort of cube shaped. And a really actually useful trick here is, so hit tab to go into edit mode, and then we're going to select we're going to go into edge select mode here. And if you click and then shift click these three edges, this is sort of like a U-shaped pattern here. What you can do is then you can hit Control E and mark seam, and you'll notice that that puts a red line on the edges of the object here, and that's because we now have a seam here, and so this is essentially where the object will be cut, if you could sort of visualize this that way. And on the other side of the object, I'm just using shift and middle mouse to pan around, look at the other side. We're going to again click and shift click to make this sort of U-shaped cut on the other side again as well, and then Control E and mark seam. And now we've got seams marked on both sides of the object. And now let's just go here on this side. And so from my perspective, I'm just looking sort of in the up here in the I guess positive Y direction, and I'm going to hit Control E, mark seam, and so now that's all the seams that you need to lay out anything that's sort of cube shaped, or this is obviously not a cube, it's elongated, but it's got the same number of verts and the same general structure. So you can always use this pattern of making a U, making another U, and then connecting the two at the bottom to unwrap anything that is vaguely cube shaped. All right, so now that we've got that, we've got those seams marked, what we want to do is hit, still in edit mode, A to select all, and then U to bring up the UV mapping menu, and we're going to click on unwrap. And you're going to see that it doesn't look like anything has changed, but if you select all and then go up into this UV editing tab here at the top, you'll notice that we have this we have our texture here on the left, and then we've also got the sort of two-dimensional laid out flat version of our box here. By the way, if you want to change the image that the UV map is laid over top of, you can do that from this drop-down menu. I currently don't have anything else loaded in here, but if, for example, this is not showing up for you, what you can do is you can just go down here and select the image, and it will lay the UV map over top of that image sample. And over here on the right, I'm just going to use the mouse wheel to scroll this over, and I'm noticing that screencast keys is not showing here. I guess it doesn't work in this panel, but I'm just going to go into viewport shading mode, and you can see that the sort of flattened out version here on the left corresponds to what's on the surface here, but it's not lined up properly to the shape of the box. And so what we can do here is just select this, and then I'm just going to rotate it until it lines up with the box. I'm going to hit R90 while being hovered over this left-hand panel here. And you can see that that's pretty close. And now I'm just going to GY to drag. And that's going to put it pretty much in place. I might just scale it in a little bit just to make sure that these all line up. There we go. And by the way, if you don't see anything over here in this left-hand panel, it's because over here on the right-hand panel, you need to have your object in edit mode and selected. So this is just like the layout tab. I knew it's the 3D viewport. If we go into edit mode and hit A to select all, over here on the left, those will appear. And so it only is currently showing the UV map for what we have selected. And there we go. So we're going to do sort of more of a in-depth talk about UV mapping, but that is essentially the gist of this. And now you can see that our image texture is nicely laid out on the object. One other thing I wanted to show you, by the way, is that you don't actually have to, over here on the left, go Shift A, texture, image texture every time. You can actually just click and drag the image texture from your desktop into this window, and it will automatically create this node here that will allow you to connect this. And so there we go, that's our object. So if we go back into layout mode and into viewport shading, we can, / to come out of that mode. We can zoom in here and have a look at our object. And that's looking pretty realistic for the 2 minutes of effort that we put into this. So that's a quick introduction to texture mapping. Again, we're going to talk more sort of in detail about normals and more in detail about UV unwrapping. But for now, that's a quick intro to get you started with sort of bringing some sort of photo scanned assets to life. All right, now I want to show you one more thing before we wrap up, which is HDRIs. So what is an HDRI? So you may have noticed in the beginning of my video that I actually have my lighting being handled here by this environment. And so how am I doing that? That is actually quite simple to do, and it gives you some pretty realistic lighting very quickly, and I use that quite a bit, and I think so will you. So you can actually go to polyhaven.com/HDRIs. There are, I think, a couple of other websites. You can look for free HDRIs online, but essentially what they are is these very sort of large scan textures that are essentially a texture of the environment. And you can actually bring those into Blender in order to light the environment around your scene, essentially sort of lighting the world. So these are usually EXR or HDR files, and I'm just downloading one currently. I'm going to show you how to add these to your environment. So there is, if you go to the shading tab here up in the top, we have the object, and then we have the material for the object. But if we look here under this drop-down menu, it says Object, Line Style, and World. If you select World, you can actually change the color of the world that's used in the render. So if I were to, for example, change this to be, orange, then this will be rendered on an orange background. And what we can do is, much like with the image texture that we apply to the object, we can actually apply image textures to the environment as well. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here under this world tab, Shift A, texture, environment texture, and I'm going to plug the color into the color input on the background node. And you'll notice it's going to go pink, and that's because we don't currently have anything in here. So with this environment texture node selected, I'm going to hit open, and I'm going to open that environment texture, and you'll notice now it will have this environment texture applied all around, and that will sort of be lighting the world and the object. One thing I want to note too, by the way, is that if you were to click and drag like we did earlier to just drag and drop this environment texture in here, you'll notice that actually doesn't work. So this created an image texture node, which which we don't want. We want an environment texture node. So if I were to take this here and plug it in, you'll see it's not working properly, and that's because this .exr is an environment texture. So you want to make sure that you are actually using Shift-A texture environment texture to load in any environment textures that you're going to be using. All right, so that's it for this video. That's quite a bit of stuff, but we'll take sort of more of an in-depth look at normals and at UV unwrapping fairly soon. So until next time.